thank you for that introduction, Robin. And I want to second your points about Philip's book. It's a remarkably compelling, granular look at the Warren Commission and its work and the personalities that drove the commission. I thought initially when I picked it up, I was wondering what it is that an author could bring that's new to this story, because it is, after all, 5 decades old, and there have been so much that's written about it, and so many investigations, so many books, movies, everything else. But Philip certainly added an entirely new perspective. But I wanted to start by asking you, Phil, what is it that got you started on this project? How did you become interested?
Well, I got to say, I began this very reluctantly because there are at least 2,000 books on the Kennedy assassination, and I didn't necessarily want to add to that library unless I had something new to add to it. And I was at my desk at the New York Times Washington Bureau in 2008, and the phone rang. And it was a very prominent American lawyer who said he had begun his career almost half a century earlier on the Warren Commission. That year, in 2008, I published my first book, which was a history of the 9/11 Commission, which both Chris and I covered. And he said he had begun his career at the Warren Commission. He had lots of great stories to tell. They'd never been told well. And wouldn't I like to do a similar book about the Warren Commission? And he promised to help me be introduced to the other lawyers who had also begun their careers in the Warren Commission, the people who really did the digging for the commission. And I thought that was a pretty tantalizing offer, and off I went. And this wasn't supposed to take 5 years, but it took 5 years because I kept stumbling onto evidence and witnesses that had clearly been denied to the Warren Commission. And I kept stumbling on evidence that apparently had been disappeared or had been destroyed before it could reach the Warren Commission. So it became a much larger book over time that I think in many ways really rewrites much of the history of the assassination.
Right. Did this person who approached you initially, did he come with the proposition that the real story of the Warren Commission had not been told, that there was some fundamental theme that had been missed, or was it simply that he wanted a more complete history of the Commission's work?
Well, I think he wanted, for most of the last 50 years, the Warren Commission has been the subject of harsh criticism and ridicule. Most Americans don't believe the Warren Commission. And I think to some extent he wanted to get onto the record the fact that he and his colleagues, the young staff members, did a good job. They did the best they could. They were individually proud of their work. Many of them joined the commission staff believing there was a conspiracy, and they were eager to find it. And I think they've all been very disappointed to discover how much evidence was withheld from them. But nonetheless, they feel they did the best job they possibly could have, and they were happy to have the opportunity to tell that story.
Sure. Are Americans right, a majority of Americans right, in not believing the Warren Commission?
Well, I do think that the record shows that the Warren Commission investigation was rushed and that they left many questions unanswered. And into those gaps, people have poured their conspiracy theories. Mm-hmm. So I'm left with a lot of criticism for the Warren Commission. In terms of the ultimate finding that Oswald was the assassin of the president, yes, I think all the most compelling evidence points to Oswald as the man who shot and killed President Kennedy. But for me, that's really only where the questions begin now, because I think there's evidence out there to show that Oswald may well have told other people what he was going to do, that other people may have encouraged him to do what he was going to do, and that part of the story was entirely missed by the Warren Commission.
Why? I mean, there seems to be the implication in your book, and in fact maybe the flat-out declaration that some of this information that would have led the Commission down the path toward exploring a potential Cuban connection to Oswald in connection with this was deliberately overlooked and avoided. What was going on there? What was that all about?
Well, it was deliberately hidden, I think, from the Warren Commission. I mean, to back up a bit, I know because a large part of my book focuses on this, is that Lee Harvey Oswald in late September 1963 goes to Mexico City. He goes there apparently to get the visas and other paperwork that will allow him to defect to Cuba, much as he had once tried to defect to Russia. He's in Mexico City for 5-6 days. He's meeting with Cuban spies and Russian spies, and he's meeting with Mexicans who are very sympathetic to Castro's revolution at a time at the height of the Cold War when some of these people may have wanted to see John Kennedy dead. John Kennedy was, as we now know, very clearly trying to kill Fidel Castro. And this whole period in Mexico City goes almost entirely uninvestigated by the CIA and the FBI after the assassination. We now know that while Oswald is in Mexico City, he's under surveillance by the CIA. They're watching him. They're listening to his telephone calls. There's evidence to believe they had photographs of him in the streets of Mexico City. And it appears, I think from the record very clearly, that the CIA and the FBI did not want to get to the bottom of what happened in Mexico because it would point out just how much they had really known about Oswald and the threat that he might pose. And that is not something they wanted the world to know, that they'd actually known a lot about Oswald, and that in fact the assassination might have been prevented if they'd simply connected the dots, an expression we both know from the 9/11 investigation.
Right. In fact, I think at one point in your book you note that there is very substantial evidence, there's direct testimony, if you will, from one of the senior commission staffer, Slauson, who said he was with Coleman in a secure room in the basement, I think, of the United States Embassy in Mexico City at some point after the assassination, and Coleman sits down to listen to CIA tape recordings of Oswald. Coleman later recounts what happens to Slauson. The CIA later denies that those tapes ever existed.
Right.
Why would they do that?
Well, I can imagine why, but I mean, just to again backtrack, so these two lawyers on the commission staff, one of them by the name of William Coleman, who's quite a famous Philadelphia lawyer, they're the two investigators on the Warren Commission staff who are responsible for trying to determine if there was a foreign conspiracy to kill Kennedy. And they go to Mexico City as part of the investigation, and they are taken to a safe room in the basement of the embassy by the local CIA station chief. And as one of the two investigators tells me in the book, they go downstairs and they are offered the opportunity to listen to CIA tape recordings of Oswald's telephone calls in Mexico City. And William Coleman, the Philadelphia lawyer, apparently sits down at a table, puts on headphones, and is listening to the telephone conversation. In the years thereafter, the CIA would deny that any of that took place because there were no tape recordings, even though the investigators remember listening to them.
Right. So the clear implication is that they destroyed evidence for whatever reason. What role did James Jesus Angleton, however he pronounced his name, play in all of this? One of the more bizarre characters in American security work.
Well, and I believe this is an important revelation in my book, which is that it turns out that during the Warren Commission investigation, a man by the name of James Jesus Angleton, who is the top mole hunter at the CIA, the chief of the counterintelligence division, muscles aside colleagues to take control of the flow of information to the Warren Commission. And over again in the course of my book, you can see that James Jesus Angleton is intervening probably to limit the amount of information that reaches the Warren Commission. And he seems to have some influence on the sharing of information in Mexico City as well. He's a person who's become famous in popular culture. There was a movie a couple of years ago called The Good Shepherd, starring Matt Damon, and the Matt Damon character is actually based on the real-life James Jesus Angleton.
Right. To what extent do you buy into the idea that maybe the CIA was protecting itself because it had been involved, as we know, in assassination plots against Castro, and that was the reason that perhaps Castro then cooperated with Oswald and that the killing took place?
Well, I think that is certainly a secret that many people wanted kept from the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission staff members who are still with us, if there's one thing that will get them very angry, it's the discussion of this, that the CIA never told the Warren Commission that for years the CIA had been trying to kill Castro, and they even used the mafia to try to kill Castro. And the decision was made at the CIA that this had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination, so therefore we're going to tell the Warren Commission nothing about it. And the same is true for Robert Kennedy, whose role, I think, in this whole story is very troubling, because he is at the center of the Kennedy administration's efforts to oust Castro. And he knows about the CIA mafia plots. And he, too, does not share any of that information with the Warren Commission. And I say that is something that is very clearly a focus of the CIA's efforts to hide from the Warren Commission. There is, my book closes with a remarkable, it's actually something I only discovered in the last several months of my research, but it turns out that the American ambassador to Mexico City, a guy by the name of Thomas Mann, who is the ambassador at the time of the assassination, he is convinced almost immediately after the assassination that the Cuban government is somehow involved in the president's murder. And he says many years later to congressional investigators in very secret testimony that shortly after the assassination in Mexico City, his phone rang and it was the Secretary of State, President Johnson's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, who had also been Kennedy's Secretary of State, with the message that he, the ambassador, is to shut down any investigation in Mexico City that might point to Cuban involvement in the president's murder. And he said he was astonished by that, and he said he thought the same order had been given to the CIA station chief and the FBI legal attaché in the embassy. And he believed the order was because the CIA was desperate to hide some covert operation they had been running out of Mexico, presumably something involving the Castro plots to kill, the CIA's plots to kill Castro.
Right. And so in other words, the concern might have been that senior CIA officials felt that they would ultimately be blamed for the Kennedy assassination because they triggered this war with Castro,
or that the investigation, if it got aggressive in Mexico City, would turn up evidence that there had been these crazy mafia plots involving the CIA. You know, maybe simply they just didn't want that scandal to break.
Right. Could you talk a little bit about Arlen Specter's role in all of this? He seems to have been probably the most relied upon of the commission staff and played a big role there.
Arlen Specter is a very key player in all this. And it's interesting how many women that I know in my life feel very strongly about Arlen Specter as a result of the Anita Hill business. And do not look on him favorably. But I do say, if you read my book, you have to look on him pretty favorably because he really did a bang-up job on the staff of the Warren Commission. He was the young lawyer. He was an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia.
Right.
He's recruited to join the Warren Commission. And he's put in charge of a lot of the medical evidence. And he's also put in charge of sort of reconstructing the events of the day of the assassination. And he is the junior lawyer on a two-man team, the senior member of which totally disappears. He just leaves. This
is the famous Francis Adams, a peculiar character, I thought. What was his role in all of this?
Well, so Specter goes to Washington, and he's told he's going to be the junior deputy to the former police commissioner of New York City, a fellow by the name of Francis Adams, who's a fancy, high-priced lawyer in New York.
Right.
And Adams apparently arrives and discovers that actually he's going to have to work. And he's going to have to, read documents, and he's going to have to get.
Right.
And he literally disappears. He goes back to Manhattan to his life there. So Specter is left all to himself to do this work, and Specter's happy about it. He's described by many people as the single most self-confident young man they had ever met. Obnoxious, but self-confident.
Right.
And he is hailed as the father of the single bullet theory. He's the guy who comes to the conclusion that actually one bullet passed through the bodies of both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly. And just recently, there's been additional scientific evidence to back him up on that, even though it's almost certainly the most controversial conclusion of the Warren Commission.
Right. I think one of the things that came through regarding Arlen Specter and Earl Warren was that Specter came to this job with a prosecutorial mindset. He was with the prosecutor, I think the district attorney's office here in Philadelphia, and had prosecuted many criminal cases. Earl Warren had been on the Supreme Court for many years, and while he was a former prosecutor himself, had been removed from that world. Was there some conflict between Specter's aggressive prosecutorial approach and Warren's more politic approach?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And in fact, it's amazing how willing Arlen Specter, and I think he must have been 32 or 33, a young man.
Right, amazing.
How willing he is to offend the Chief Justice of the United States over and over again. And usually for the right reasons, Chief Justice Warren doesn't want this job. He absolutely does not want this job, and he takes the job only because President Johnson brings him into the Oval Office and says, you have to take this job. If you don't take this job, we're facing World War III, and you, Mr. Chief Justice, will be responsible for World War III. And apparently the confrontation leaves Earl Warren in tears, but agreeing to take the job. But Earl Warren was an old prosecutor from Oakland, California, and he thought that Oswald was just another one of the violent thugs, like so many he'd prosecuted back in Northern California. He didn't see a conspiracy. He wanted this investigation over with just as quickly as it could be done. And repeatedly, there are confrontations between the Chief Justice and Specter, who's saying, you cannot cut corners here. We have to get all the facts. And there's a very big battle between Arlen Specter and the Chief Justice over two questions. One is whether or not Jacqueline Kennedy will testify before the investigation, and also the question of the autopsy photos.
Right, right.
The Chief Justice takes one look at the autopsy photos, decides they're so horrible that they will be shown to nobody on the staff, none of the other commissioners. And Specter, who's responsible for the medical evidence, says that's ridiculous. They are the essential medical evidence we need to do this job of understanding how the president died and who might have killed him. And Specter is willing repeatedly to protest, to demand access to the autopsy photos. He's ultimately not successful, but he certainly tries.
Right. Why do you think Warren denied the commission staff access to the autopsy photos? I mean, that's such a key piece of evidence, and he's responsible ultimately for the work product that they're about to issue, and it's what you'd call a shoddy investigation in a way.
Well, he's. And it was a terrible mistake, if only because mistakes were made in the autopsy, and those autopsy photos would have clarified a lot of issues. And so many of the conspiracy theories involve the condition of the president's body. So Specter was absolutely right to demand them. Earl Warren just adored President Kennedy and the Kennedy family, and that's one of the reasons he didn't want to take on this assignment, because he did not want to have to spend months of his life thinking every day, every hour about the president's death. And repeatedly during the course of the investigation, you see Warren making decisions that seem designed to protect President Kennedy's legacy and to preserve the privacy of the Kennedy family, even if that means that not all the facts are gathered about the assassination. So.
Right.
It's the scene, he's in his chambers in the Supreme Court, and an envelope is brought in that has a bunch of photographs in it, and they are the autopsy photos. And he says he takes a look at them, and they are just as horrifying as you would imagine them to be. And he says he can't sleep well for nights thereafter. And he says on the spot, he made the decision, and he never apologized for it, that nobody else would ever see these pictures. They would be returned to the Justice Department, where Robert Kennedy would control them, and the Kennedy family would decide what would become of them. And I say the Warren Commission staff, the other commissioners never see them.
Let me ask you, what would the autopsy photos, perhaps, what blanks would they have filled in, especially since I thought the frames from the Zapruder film, when matched up with the single bullet theory, are very convincing as to how Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman in this. What could?
I think if they were convincing, we wouldn't have a million conspiracy theories, and we wouldn't have Oliver Stone's movie. So
right. You're not convinced
by Oliver Stone's movie?
No. Well, no. By the single bullet theory.
Oh yeah, I think say scientists who've been over this evidence support it,
right,
and using techniques that were not available to the Warren Commission. But I'm sorry, your question is whether...
Well, I mean, what would the autopsy photos have, what questions would they have answered, especially in light of the fact that the single bullet theory is so persuasive?
The most essential things they would have sorted out, including the fact that the autopsy report misidentified the location of both of the entry wounds in the president's body.
Right, okay.
The autopsy, we're going to talk about the autopsy just 1 minute, because it leads to so many of the conspiracy theories. On the plane back from Dallas to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington on the date of the assassination, Jacqueline Kennedy is asked where she would like her husband's autopsy to be performed. And naturally, she first says she doesn't see the need for an autopsy. She doesn't want an autopsy. She doesn't want that to happen. It's explained to her that there has to be an autopsy. It's a legal necessity. Her husband's the victim of a crime. And she's given a choice of two hospitals. One is the Bethesda Naval Hospital, which is in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, or the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which is just inside the border of Washington. They're 8 miles apart. And because her husband had been in the Navy, she chooses Bethesda. But even Navy pathologists would have told her that was a bad idea, because Navy pathologists just do not have the experience with gunshot wounds that their Army counterparts do. You know, soldiers tend to suffer bullet wounds more often than sailors do. And the two Navy doctors who are put in charge of the autopsy, neither of them, they're pathologists, but neither of them is a forensic pathologist, the branch of pathology that deals with crimes and murders. And they are also put in a situation where they are rushed. Jacqueline Kennedy comes to Bethesda with the president's body and announces that she will not leave the hospital until the autopsy is finished. She won't leave unless she can take her husband's body with her. So the autopsy doctors, on top of everything else, they feel incredibly rushed and pressured. And one of the doctors describes the autopsy as a 3-ring circus, which seems to be a pretty accurate description. Mm-hmm. So the mistakes made that night they're almost predictable. And again, so many of those the mistakes made that night in the autopsy room would lead to the conspiracy theories about what happened to the president's body.
Right, and one of those mistakes, of course, is the doctor who was leading the autopsy burned his handwritten notes soon after for fear that they would get in the hands of some carnival barker or somebody trying to make money off of it.
I did, there were a handful of moments in my reporting for this that were sort of truly jaw-dropping, where I just couldn't believe that I was reading this. But the Navy pathologist who's in charge of the autopsy, a guy by the name of James Hume, the night after the autopsy, he has to write out the final autopsy report for the White House, which is going to be presented on Sunday, November 24th. And it's late at night, and he's dog-tired, and he sets up a card table in his home in Bethesda, not far from the hospital. And there's a fire roaring in the fireplace. And as in front of him, he has the draft autopsy report from the autopsy room and all of his notes from the autopsy room, and then a fresh piece of paper so he can write out the final autopsy report. And as he's sitting there, he notices that the draft autopsy report and all of his notes are stained with the president's blood. Mm-hmm. And he says he is so appalled by that, and he's so appalled by the thought that these documents might turn up someday in some assassination museum, some awful souvenir, that he stands up and he goes to the fireplace and he puts into the fire, the original autopsy report and all of his notes. And when the Warren Commission investigators, and Arlen Specter in particular, hear about this, they are horrified, because they think that even if it was the most innocent decision, even if he was justified in thinking that these documents might turn up in some museum someplace, that was the makings. The destruction of the original autopsy report was the makings of a million conspiracy theories someday, and so be it.
I want to ask you one last question about the autopsy report, because I think it's important, even though it is the details are really quite gruesome and very distressing. They would have, as I understand it, shut down conspiracy theories in that they would have shown where the entrance and exit wounds were, and if they, the ballistic test showed, I think, conclusively that Oswald was the person who was the assassination, but you have these persistent stories that there was somebody shooting from the so-called grassy knoll, which would have meant that the president would have been hit from the front rather than behind. Is that the question that the autopsy photos might have put to rest forever?
Well, I mean, there's still to this day are there people who argue that they were shots from the front, and
Right.
that if the doctors had seen the autopsy photos from the start, they would have seen that these were entrance wounds, not
Right, right.
There's just so much confusion that they were central evidence that would have clarified these issues years ago, but unfortunately we've been left with so many conspiracy theories, including now conspiracy theories that the autopsy photos were switched over the years. That
Right.
We're left with this mess of,
Right.
this morass of confusion.
Just going back to Earl Warren's role in all of this, in reading your book, I think it would be much too strong a term to say that he whitewashed or photoshopped aspects of this investigation, but he didn't seem to conduct himself, at least that was my takeaway, as a hard-nosed prosecutor here, and had more of a political concern. Did he ever open up about what his motivations were in making the decisions in any of his books, any conversations with people?
Well,
Because he wasn't a hard-nosed prosecutor, from what I could tell, based on your writing.
He was.
He was not in this investigation.
Oh, this investigation, no. I mean, well, the reason is because I think, and he did write this later, that he just became very convinced very early on, within weeks.
Mm-hmm.
There was no conspiracy. Oswald did it. He did it alone. And so what is there to investigate here?
Mm-hmm.
And let's move on. Let's try to end all these conspiracy theories. There's a presidential election coming. We need to get this over with before the election begins. And he had his own work to do on the Supreme Court. He had momentous decisions. That was the year of New York Times v.
Right.
Sullivan. There were all sorts of very important cases before the Supreme Court, and that was the work he loved, and that was the work he thought would be his legacy, not this miserable commission assignment that he didn't want in the first place.
Right. Did it affect him physically? I mean, did it affect his health? It must have, I would.
Apparently, over the course of the year, he looks increasingly, fatigued and increasingly sort of ill.
Right.
And one of his former clerks, who's on the staff of the Warren Commission, becomes increasingly concerned about his health.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that I really love about this book are the many, many details that have such resonance. And one of them was this incident. One of the early eyewitnesses, or the only eyewitness, I think, who actually places Oswald on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and sees him with the gun pulling the trigger, I think, Howard Brennan. Mm-hmm. What was most interesting about that to me was you write that Brennan then declines to identify Oswald in a police lineup later on because he's afraid that there is a conspiracy out there and he's going to be killed. This is around the same time, of course, that the Kitty Genovese story, the greatly exaggerated Kitty Genovese story, is circulating. What did you make of that? Was there, I mean, that kind of human frailty has a kind of reality to it that really resonated with me, and was distressing in a way. It was kind of very, very distressing detail.
That made sense. But so, backtracking a bit, Howard Brennan is sitting on a little wall across from the Texas School Book Depository at the time of the assassination. And he says that, as the president's motorcade is arriving in Dealey Plaza, he looks up and he sees a man with a rifle. And he sees, as the motorcade progresses, he sees this man firing his rifle. Presumably it's Oswald. And later Howard Brennan, who's I think a steam fitter, he says he's convinced it's Oswald. But when he's taken to police headquarters that afternoon to do a lineup to identify Oswald, he refuses to do it. He says he can't pick out Oswald, and his reasoning, he says, is because he feared that there was a massive communist conspiracy at that moment to overthrow the U.S. government, and that if he identified the president's killer, he would later be killed himself. And that makes sense. As you were saying, there was at that moment a big story in America about this woman who's killed in New York City by the name of Kitty Genovese, who apparently at the time it was reported had been overheard screaming and was overheard by dozens of people screaming and pleading for her life, and these people ignored her. So it made sense that to the Warren Commission investigators that this man would also be too scared to tell the truth about who had killed the president.
Right. A little interesting detail in that footnote about Kitty Genovese, and I guess this has been out, but I hadn't noticed it, that in fact there were, even though the reports at the time indicated that 38 to 40 people heard her scream for help and did nothing. In fact, only 2 or 3 people were in a position to...
That was my newspaper, the New York Times, that got that all wrong, apparently.
Well, and many, maybe the same reporters who were covering the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know. Let's hope not. You know, one of the things that, you know, I reading the book, very compelling, granular story, and a lot of the personalities come out in all of this, but also really distressing in a way. I mean, this was a signal event in American history. The security around the president was terrible, as you made clear. The investigation was shoddy. The agency investigations weren't investigations. They were probably like cover-ups. But if you fast forward to the 9/11 Commission, 40, 50 years later, one positive point, it seems to me, is that that kind of shoddy investigation didn't take place and couldn't take place in this day and age. Because is that a correct perception? And if so, why?
Absolutely. And, you know, history will show the 9/11 Commission did a much better job. Mm-hmm. You know, in 1963, it's amazing to discover that actually people had confidence in their government. That a lot of these lawyers came to Washington, you know, the staff of the 9/11 Commission, the people who really did the digging, were these young hotshot lawyers, most of them in their, you know, late 20s, 30s, early 40s, who came to Washington, many of them believing there was a conspiracy that they wanted to find, but not realizing they were up against these agencies like the CIA and the FBI that would lie to them and that would hide information from them. You know, as a result, actually, largely as a result of the Kennedy assassination, people don't have that same confidence in their government anymore. They're not going to go in assuming that the CIA and the FBI and other government agencies are going to tell them the truth. They will now demand the truth, and they'll dig for it if need be. At the time of the Warren Commission, that just wasn't the case.
Right, and presumably, I mean, the 9/11 Commission understood that the public would want more transparency and perhaps a more aggressive investigation than was the case during the Warren Commission.
I think that's true. And of course, in the 9/11 Commission, you also had the families of all of those victims who were
right.
demanding the truth, and they're every day demanding the truth.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about the single bullet theory and why I gather from your book you find that persuasive, as do I.
During the course of the book tour, I'm trying to do this, learn the shorthand of how to describe this. I think I've got it now. When the 9/11 Commission staff arrives in Washington, they are presented with the initial FBI report on the assassination, which we now know was a pretty shoddy job by the FBI. The FBI concludes on the basis of very little that 3 bullets hit the president's limousine in Dealey Plaza. First bullet hits President Kennedy in the back, second bullet hits Governor Connolly in the back, and the third bullet hits President Kennedy in the head, which would be the fatal shot. But using the Zapruder film, the home movie, which you've all seen, I'm sure, as sort of a clock on the assassination, the staff could determine pretty quickly that Oswald just didn't have time to get off 3 individual shots. And if he didn't have time, that means there has to be a second gunman in Dealey Plaza. It's actually one of the Navy pathologists who conducts the autopsy, who, in conversation with Arlen Specter, who says, you know, maybe what happened here is that 1 bullet actually went through 2 men. Mm-hmm. And that appears to be the answer, that 1 bullet enters President Kennedy, the first bullet that hits President Kennedy goes through him and goes into Governor Connolly. And
then disintegrates somewhat, causing these fragments to show up
in Connolly's body. But, but it's sometimes referred to as the magic bullet or the pristine bullet because it's not very damaged.
Right.
And that was part of the confusion. How could this bullet go through 2 bodies and have so little damage done to it? Mm-hmm. But you know, the scientists who know this evidence who know this, you know, the ballistics say that it's not all that surprising that the bullet wouldn't be more damaged than it was.
Was Oswald that much of a marksman? I mean, I still don't have a clear sense of what the distance was. The Zapruder film made clear that the motorcade was traveling, which is of course a security issue, at 11 miles per hour, so that's pretty slow.
Very slow.
How far away was Oswald?
I'm going to blank on exactly how. You know, it's from the 6th floor down to the street below. It's not that far.
Okay.
And Oswald was in the Marines. He was trained in the use of a rifle. He'd hunted as a kid. He'd hunted all of his life. And he had a reasonably good rifle, a cheap rifle, but a reasonably good one with a scope on it.
Right.
And I'll tell you, I don't know much about rifles or guns, but I can tell you I've been to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and looked out that window, and I got to tell you, it was an easy shot. It would be an easy shot for somebody without much weapons training.
You mean it's less than a half a football field away?
Yeah.
It's closer than that.
And the motorcade is moving 11 miles an hour. If the Marine Corps does not give training to a Marine to hit a shot like that, I don't know what good the Marine Corps is. I think I certainly had the sense it was a very easy shot.
Right. And that brings up, I think, another sort of very interesting aspect of your book, which is your discussion of the security around the president, which wasn't a very long portion of it, but I think really kind of compelling. The security that the Secret Service provided and the Dallas Police. And one thing that stuck with me was that Philip describes the Dallas Police as not so much in a position of protecting the president, but rather acting as spectators, kind of groupies for the president, looking at him and not looking at the buildings, scanning the buildings for potential threats. That was shocking to me. The incompetence was disturbing.
It's the Secret Service. The performance of the Secret Service is just astonishing, and not in a good way. The president was really a sitting duck. There was a slow-moving motorcade. Nobody was scanning the buildings up above. The Warren Commission staff investigators described their horror at looking at the newsreels of the scene in Dealey Plaza and seeing the local police officers focused in on the excitement in front of them, Jackie Kennedy going by in the limousine, rather than the threats that might be up above. And the same is true of the Secret Service. The Secret Service agents aren't looking up either. And the thing about the Secret Service, which I don't think many people focus on, is especially in light of the current scandals involving the Secret Service, is that it turns out that some of the Secret Service agents on the president's motorcade in Dallas had been out drinking the night before, in total violation of the rules of conduct of the Secret Service, a fireable offense. And they'd been out until, I think some of them had been out till about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they'd been drinking at local bars. And the Secret Service does a pretty darn good job of covering that up. I mean, that is something that they do their best to hide from the Warren Commission. And it's only when Chief Justice Warren insists that the Secret Service fess up that it does.
Was when they did fess up, and as a consequence of that, because I know now, I remember, in Washington, whenever, and around here, whenever there's a presidential visit, I mean, there are snipers on rooftops, people scanning the top of a building. I'm assuming that led to some very substantial improvements in the security protocols.
No. Now, of course, the President of the United States is almost totally isolated from the public as a result of the assassination.
I want to ask you, well, you haven't really what can you tell us about Oswald? What's your impression of him, where he came from, what he was all about? Creepy character, for sure.
Yeah, he's, this unstable young man, who an egomaniac. He thought he had a great role to play in history, which I think explains a lot of why he did what he did. It's interesting to talk with some of the Warren Commission staff members, because they obviously had to do a lot of thinking about Oswald as well. He's a young man he wasn't a spy, I don't think, but he thought of himself as a spy. So everything was done in secret. Everything was, it's amazing at the age of 24, he's accomplished as much as he has. He's traveled around the world. He's almost defected to 2 countries.
Incredibly well-traveled.
But it's interesting to talk to Warren Commission staffers who say that if you really want to understand Lee Harvey Oswald, you should understand his mother, Marguerite, who plays a rather substantial role in my book, who really was a monster, and also had the same sense that she had a great role to play in the world, and she needed to be recognized, and she had given this trait to her son as well.
I came away with the feeling that Marguerite was very self-serving and narcissistic, but monster. I mean, what more do you know about her that? Except that
I just remember she has 3 sons, and she puts 2 of them into an orphanage in New Orleans.
Right.
And she keeps Lee, who's the youngest, with her for a while, but then she decides the day after Christmas to put Lee into the orphanage. And to wait, apparently with the idea she would get enough money to get them out of the orphanage and resume their life together, but still.
Okay. Well, we have some questions here that some of which are quite detailed and track with your book here. Here's a question. The Oswald wanted to meet with Marina on, I think, 11/22, or the night before the assassination, to reconcile.
Right. And
she turned him down, and you pointed out that she later testified that she planned to reconcile, but not right then. Had she not refused, would that have changed the course of history?
I think yes. No, I think she says that she felt guilty because Oswald comes to her. They're living apart. Oswald's living in Dallas in a rooming house, and she is living in Irving, Texas, nearby with a friend. And Oswald comes out to her the night before the assassination and apparently pleads with her for a reconciliation.
Right.
And apparently is in tears in making this plea. And she refuses, with the intention, she says, of eventually reconciling. And she says that had she simply taken him back in that night, that none of this would have happened.
And that would tend to weigh against the idea of a massive conspiracy, wouldn't it? That this was just an unbalanced young man who may have been provoked or pushed in the most extreme circumstances by foreign government agents, but was acting rather, in an ad hoc kind of way.
It would certainly argue against the sort of conspiracy that most people talk about.
Right,
yes.
And you find that credible, her account of what of that?
I don't see anything to dispute it. I think that it does sound reasonable.
Okay. By the way, and another question here is: are the autopsy photos now available, or are they still in deep freeze?
Unfortunately, you can find them easily on the internet.
Okay. Okay. Another excellent question. What implication does your research have on the credibility of our current CIA senior officials?
It does not reflect well on the credibility of past CIA officials. I don't know quite how to answer that. Other than I will say the arrogance of the leadership of the CIA at that time is just extraordinary, and their belief that the decision was made at the CIA that they would be fully cooperative with the Warren Commission on anything the Warren Commission asked for, but they would volunteer nothing. And that, including the things they didn't volunteer, was the fact that they'd been trying to kill a key suspect in the Kennedy assassination investigation, when it was Fidel Castro.
The stories that came out about the CIA's attempts to kill Castro, I think, included at one point a crazy plot to have somebody give him an exploding cigar. I think that if that's any indication of how competent they are, we're all in trouble. Another interesting question here. Can you talk we haven't spoken at all about Jack Ruby, another extremely unbalanced character in this. What is your best assessment of why he did what he did?
Jack Ruby was very much like Oswald in the sense that he wanted to be known. He wanted to be a bit of a celebrity. He wanted to make his mark in history. But Ruby was an equally unstable man, and certainly an argument against Ruby being part of some larger conspiracy is the fact that he was a delusional blabbermouth. That if you're the common conspiracy theory involving Ruby is that the mafia somehow recruited him to silence Oswald by killing him that Sunday in Dallas. But I'll tell you, if the mafia, I tend to believe that the leaders of the mafia, they may be corrupt, they may be violent, but I tend to believe they're rational. And this is the last guy on earth you would want to recruit to carry out the crime of the century.
Right. And yet there were these interesting innuendos and implications. Ruby had tried to make contact with the Cuban government, I think, at some point. Didn't he ask for a visa and he also had mob connections and the like.
Ruby definitely throughout his life had low-level ties to organized crime. He's raised in the tough streets of Chicago. He ran a strip club in Dallas. He dealt with unsavory types all of his life.
Right.
And he did at some point try to do business in Cuba. Actually, after Castro took over, he tried to sell Jeeps or find other sort of entrepreneurial opportunities there, but they never panned out, as so much of Jack Ruby's life never panned out. And that, those ties were what gave rise to a lot of the conspiracy theories about him. But I think history, the record shows that he was a very, very unstable, I would argue, mentally ill man who is just the least likely participant in a massive, sophisticated conspiracy.
Right. Because you do write about the interviews that a couple of psychiatrists had with him in his jail cell after the killing of Oswald, and he's banging his head against the wall and.
Oh, he's ramming his head into the wall. He's
right,
running
right,
into the wall.
Right. Running into the wall. And it occurred to me that, one explanation for that is, in a situation like this, is a man who's facing the death penalty, and one of his defenses might be that, hey, you can't hold me accountable. I'm insane. Right. Was there any evidence of that kind of extreme mental illness before, while he was running his strip club operations and living his daily life in Dallas?
Well, people before the assassination, people also thought of him as unstable and certainly as a blabbermouth, a guy who couldn't keep a secret.
Okay. Do you believe, and this is another question, that the commission adequately and fully investigated Ruby's role in this event?
No, and I can say that because there's certainly an ongoing drama in the book of the two staff investigators who are assigned to piece together Ruby's life. Are very unhappy. They think that they're being treated as, that their part of the investigation is being treated as the stepchild of the larger investigation, that they have all sorts of unanswered questions about ties between Ruby and organized crime. So no, I don't think all of that was, again, the commission needed more time to do what it was going to do, and among things it should have done was get more answers about Ruby.
Right. I want to go back. One other quick question on Oswald. Did he have any education? Did he ever have a job? Did he? He comes from a poor and very difficult upbringing. You describe him as unstable. Did he ever get any kind of footing aside from his time in the Marines, which ended in a disfavorable discharge, or whatever the term was? Not dishonorable, but something just above that.
Right. No, he had great trouble. He was not well educated. He was intelligent. There are actually tape recordings you can hear if you go to YouTube. And he's articulate, and but apparently he was dyslexic. He had great trouble in school. He had great trouble holding a job, principally because he always got bored at jobs. He just didn't want to hold on to them because he wanted to be a great man, and this was not a way of being a great man. These menial jobs he found himself in.
And he wanted to take shortcuts or something, right? What about Marina Oswald? What became of her?
She lives in Dallas. I'm sort of surprised she'd want to stick around Texas, but she did. She's there with another husband, and the two children she had with Oswald have gone on to apparently very productive lives. She's a big focus of the investigation by the Warren Commission, because there really were a lot of suspicions on the staff of the Warren Commission that she had played a role in the plot, that she might have been some sort of Russian agent. At the end of the day, the Warren Commission didn't find anything to confirm any of that, but there certainly were suspicions about her throughout.
Okay. Here's an interesting point that I never was aware of. Was Kennedy considering going to Gettysburg for the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's address instead of Dallas? Was that a possible, could he have taken another turn that would have averted all of this? Did that ever come up in your research?
No, I haven't heard that. If that's true, that's really interesting, because they're the same week, right?
Right. Okay. And here's another point that another person in the audience makes the point that Lee Harvey Oswald never threatened President Kennedy. I don't know whether that's accurate or not, but he certainly did threaten or express great anger at John Connally when he was Secretary of the Navy and he had been discharged from the Marines. Is that? Are there any records of any threat by Oswald?
Well, let me tell you the most. I hate to use the words again, but jaw-dropping, the most jaw-dropping document I found in all my years of research was a memo that J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, wrote to the Warren Commission in June 1964, right in the middle of the Warren Commission investigation, in which Hoover revealed that the FBI had received credible evidence that while Oswald was in Mexico City in September 1963, he marched into a communist embassy, and it was almost certainly the Cuban embassy, and announced he was going to kill President Kennedy. And you would think that if that document had reached the Warren Commission, there would have been a million questions about who else in Mexico City heard this, and did anybody encourage him to go forward with this plan? But that document appears to have disappeared. It never reached the Warren Commission investigators who should have seen it. And I know this because I've shown them that document, and I said, "Did you see this?" They said, "Absolutely not," and they're very angry because had they known about it, there would have been a much more aggressive investigation in Mexico City of who knew that Oswald was talking openly of killing President Kennedy.
Yeah, and I got the impression from your book that Warren, maybe because, as you say, Warren had already decided that Oswald was acting alone, an unbalanced young man, sought to direct attention away from the Mexico City angle.
Well, I think maybe the single most baffling decision Warren makes during the course of the investigation is one. There's a woman in Mexico City, a Mexican woman, young woman who works in the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, who is the woman who dealt face-to-face with Oswald while he was there trying to get the visas. And she appears to have been very friendly with him. In fact, there is evidence to suggest she had a brief affair with Oswald while he was in Mexico. And the Warren Commission staff sees her as an essential witness. You know, she's somebody who might well have been, who might know a lot about Oswald and what his thinking was. And they are pressing to get an interview with this woman. And actually, word comes from Mexico City that this woman will agree to come to Washington to be interviewed. And the staffers are thrilled about this, and they go to Warren and say, you know, may we have your permission to bring her to Washington to talk to her? And Warren says no. And Warren says, no, she's a communist, and we don't talk to communists. Those are his words. And the staff, I learned this in my interviews with the staff members, but they thought that was just perplexing, and they wondered, was that Warren just making a terrible decision, or was he somehow influenced not to interview this woman because she might reveal something the CIA didn't want revealed? Or
what's your take on that? I mean, it's a highly irrational decision. One would on its face.
Yeah, actually, it does. There's a pattern though too with Warren, and again, there's a pattern of bad decisions by Warren. Earlier on in the investigation, the staff had wanted to go to the Cuban government and say, we'd like all of the paperwork involving Oswald's visa request in Mexico City, anything else you know about him. And Warren said, no, we're not going to do that because we can't deal with this communist government. It's interesting, he drew a distinction though. He could deal with the Soviet Union. He saw them as sort of an established communist government. But he wouldn't deal with the Cubans because he saw them as sort of, the bearded revolutionaries. We're not going to deal with them. And so this woman who was an essential witness should have been an essential witness before the Warren Commission, never testified. I will tell you, though, that I found her. I found her earlier this year, and she insists she did not have an affair with Lee Harvey
This
Oswald.
is Sylvia Duran.
Sylvia Duran.
That's a whole other book, I think.
She's writing her own, apparently. So we'll find out more from her.
I want to ask. We have, I think, time for one last question. I want to ask you. The meeting that you write about of Coleman and Castro off the coast of Cuba. What did Coleman, and Coleman, by the way, is a really important figure in, as you say, as you noted in your book, in the civil rights movement. He was a very important lawyer in Philadelphia for many years, and played a central role in the Ford administration. He was the Secretary of Transportation, and also on a number of occasions had been on the short list as a Supreme Court nominee. He told Phil that he had met with Castro as part of the Warren Commission investigation off the coast of Cuba. Did he indicate to you what, if any, useful information he got out of that?
Well, the story, as it was told to me by Mr. Coleman, was that Castro, who was adamant from the day of the assassination that he had nothing to do with the murder of President Kennedy, sends word to the Warren Commission that he wants to testify, to state this again for the official record. You know, but in those days, Castro was, for many Americans, and I guess still is today for many Americans, the devil. You know, you can't have an official investigation dealing face to face with Fidel Castro.
Right.
So the decision was made to have Coleman go to the waters off Cuba to meet up with Castro's yacht. And apparently for 3 hours, Coleman sat and listened to Castro explain how he had nothing to do with the assassination. And a wonderful backstory to this is that apparently part of the reason Coleman was selected for the assignment was because Coleman, who was African American, and because he couldn't go to the jazz clubs in Midtown Manhattan in the 1940s and 1950s, went to the jazz clubs in Harlem at a time when Fidel Castro used to visit New York periodically and liked the jazz clubs of Harlem.
Yeah.
And they meet in the jazz clubs of Harlem, you know, many years before this encounter in the waters off Cuba.
It's a remarkably serendipitous series of events there. Well, thank you, Philip. I mean,
My
it's
pleasure.
been a
Thank you.
tremendous book, and I really enjoyed it.
Terrific.
Yeah, great.
I'd be intrigued to know, how many of you believe there was a conspiracy to kill the president? That's about 60. That's about the average for them. Yeah.
Right. It's distressing, the whole thing. Okay.